minutes. Oh, that happened quicker than I thought it was going to. It might be worth waiting a few minutes just to see if we get, I'll pause it. Since it is, oh, sorry, since it is nice and intimate, please feel free to kind of participate and join in the conversation. But first, just to welcome everyone, nice to meet you. My name is Nikki Banks and I'm co-hosting this panel with Deborah Doan. Deborah, do you want to say a quick hello? So Deborah is the convener of the RINGO project, the Reimagining the International NGO project. I'm an academic at the University of Manchester, and I've been a very enthusiastic participant in the Reimagining the International NGO Social Lab. We thought this would be a really nice place to talk about the RINGO project. Academic debate around NGOs has been a very lively part of research in the academic community for at least the last 30 years. Research has kind of looked at the place of NGOs, the added values that they offer in the aid chain, and in particular, they've been very critical about the constraints that they face in living up to their transformative potential, given the kind of the place that they hold in the aid chain and the relationships that they have with other actors that they work with. There's been much theorizing, rich case studies, there's been deep empirical evidence, and there's been some really interesting collaborations between and within academics, development practitioners, and NGOs themselves. Of course, that makes it quite a lively place of debate, but it's also sometimes contentious when researchers from an outside perspective can be seen to be being very critical about people that we are researching rather than researching with NGOs in partnerships and collaborations. I don't think the academic world has got the question of, or the ability to kind of recognize diversity in all its richness too well either. Diversity by size of NGOs, by the type of NGOs, by its geography, by membership. All of these factors really influence what organizations seek to do, how they operate, and how they achieve. So I think we have a lot to learn from practice, as well as hopefully be able to contribute to practice. And I think that's where something like the RINGO project comes in so nicely. RINGO, I think, was particularly interesting to me because it was not just another opportunity to talk about and identify problems in the system. It really stands apart for its desire to identify these problems, but then to take it that one step further and design specific tangible prototypes to start breaking down these challenges and to address them. And I think lastly, just to say, I think it's a really important session here at the Development Studies Association, because I do feel like the academic and the research community is quite far behind the NGO sector at the moment when it comes to these discussions and debates around localization, around the need for locally led development, and the really important foundational shift the power movement. We just haven't kept up with this discussion and debate. Our timelines are different and we're operating quite far behind. So I think some of the prototypes that we'll see here today will hopefully give some flavor and inspiration to the wider research community around the importance of this agenda. But with those sort of introductory comments, let me pass over to Deborah, who's going to introduce the RINGO project in all its glory and a bit more detail.
Thanks, Nikki. Hopefully you will have seen the pre-presentations that were done, and thank you everyone for submitting those. I know it's a bit of a faff, but that's great. I'm just going to give a tiny bit of context around RINGO. I mean, it came, for me, I brought it together out of a kind of 25 years of frustration working within and kind of around the INGO community. My first role in the 90s was trying to set up an international ombudsman for humanitarian aid after the Rwanda evaluation that kept getting diluted and diluted. And I guess I was finally determined to do something about it after a string of very recent events. The first was a meeting that was convened in South Africa when this whole idea of kind of localization was really on the rise. It was convened by Civicus, and it was a group of international and regional funders and local civil society groups about trying to understand why there wasn't more resource going to Global South organizations. And I think Civicus calculated that it was in the region of 0.2% at that point. It was just a paltry amount. The second was some work that I was doing around civic space, the enabling environment for civil society. And our prototype in Swaziland certainly is aware of this issue. And I found that the INGOs were often dividing themselves from the rights-based organizations. In some countries, we actually saw they kind of threw the human rights community under a bus in order to protect their own access to restrictive countries. And in a workshop, a senior leader admitted to us that, let's be honest, we love nothing more than when one organization gets kicked out, we get more of the resources. And then, of course, in 2018, we had the whole Me Too scandals finally emerge. So to cut a long story short, the sector has been dysfunctional for civil society for some time. And there's a lot more background that we've put together on our website. So our response to this wasn't more research. It was about creating an opportunity for both thought and action. So we created this systems change lab through Rights CoLab. The core founding team were a mix of Global North and Global South people. The West African Civil Society Institute, for example, is one of our core organizers in the process. And we have experts in systems change processes. And from there, we gathered a kind of microcosm of the system. Initially 55 innovators, now 95 people participating in our different prototypes, who applied to be with us, and they were across development, human rights, humanitarian, and environment sectors. And that's acknowledging that they all share a lot of the same challenges about how to function in this sector. We also have people from the funding community, Global South, and academics to help us understand why the system is stuck. And then we identified opportunities there were to change parts of the system. We now have co-designed and launched 8 prototypes, some of which you'll hear, we'll talk a bit more and get into a little bit more today. And they touch on 4 quadrants for change. And I could share a screen, but let's actually not for now. They're in governance and leadership, accountability, solidarity and partnerships, and risk and resources. And all of these prototypes were selected for the potential to transform one area of stuckness in the system. Some of them are hitting out at real nerdy stuff, like that one organization can't do, like getting more resource to the system, or which you'll hear from Bert about, the donor risk management system, or Nicola's work on our fundraising models. Others are looking at new ways to, say, build solidarity and to work alongside local CSOs. So we'll hear from an alternative solidarity model, which is building, demands from what civil society needs from below and asking the INGOs to be in service to that, rather than INGOs being resourced to do a project and going out and seeking partners. So it turns that relationship on its head. The final team we were going to hear from today, unfortunately, the representative is unwell, but this was on climate justice transition. And what's interesting, well, there's many things that are interesting about this one, but it's being led by a national organization who was part of an INGO, who is now separating from that INGO. And that what they're doing is demonstrating how a national or a local CSO can work directly with the multilateral sector. They can broker relations with local communities very effectively. And quite frankly, the INGOs in this are effectively redundant. I'll put a link to our website so you can find out more. Almost all of our prototypes are hosted and led by a Global South organization. And I just to conclude this little intro, my own hypothesis is that the role of INGOs will ultimately be smaller. I think the exponential growth we did see in the 90s and the noughties will have to end. And the functions, and this is my own hypothesis, the functions of it will be based on, I think, solidarity rather than service delivery. And that we can innovate much better ways to get more resources to national and local organizations with the right systems in place, and that they're actually better placed to do the work of development. This will lead, I think, to a stronger civil society in the long run. So that's my little spiel. I think what we want to do is just a bit of a Q&A style with our guests present. And then because we're such a small group, actually, I'll ask some questions, but feel free to just pop your hand up and we can take questions as we go along. So just to welcome our guests from the RINGO project here today. We've got Bert Martin, who's from HelpAge International, head of transformation. And Bert is really helping to co-lead the risk prototype. We have Tabo Masuka and Venetia Govinder, who are from Letfu Sonke, who are working on leading this alternative solidarity model, almost, a call to action for INGOs. And we're missing, and I will mention her name, unfortunately, Nikki my computer's trying to update. Sorry, Nikki De La Rosa from formerly, International Alert Philippines, but which is becoming an independent organization, Cyclica. I did want to acknowledge her work because her video is up there. So I guess the first question I want to just start with, and I'm going to direct this at Bert and Nikki, because you two came to RINGO on application at the very beginning, whereas the others have joined with the prototyping process, which is kind of halfway through the lab. And I guess what I really want to ask you is why? Why did you join RINGO? Why did you apply to be part of our mad, crazy scheme that makes us all way too busy? Do you want to start, Bert?
Oh, sure. It's lovely to be here and nice to be connected this way. Yeah, why? I mean, as Nikki said earlier, for a number of years in our sector, there have been these debates and spaces for dialogue around shifting power, decolonization of aid, or localization. But I felt from the very beginning, the RINGO Reimagining INGO was interesting because as a social lab, it was really about doing the hard work. And we have been working very hard indeed. It was different. It is different because it's not just talking about ideas and analyzing, but then actually now doing the hard work and putting the hours in it. And that appealed to me. I guess two more reasons for me was that proposition to use systems thinking and prototyping, which is not totally new, but still novel for me. And indeed, I think for many of us in the lab, and how to dance with the system and use the insights and then do this prototyping methodology in a different way. Because I think in the sector, we're very used to more piloting and projectizing things. And it is a challenge, but that I think is interesting because what we're dealing with is complex. I mean, some may call it, these are wicked problems, right? And so here's that opportunity. And lastly, the group is carefully curated with that diversity. And I must say in the past year and a half, I've managed to connect with so many different perspectives and people. So that's been a big gain. And so the diversity and the leadership coming from different parts of the world, including and maybe in particular the Global South, is what appealed to me. So these were my reasons to be part of this.
Thanks, Bert. And Nicola, what about you?
So for me as an academic, I applied with great enthusiasm, not sure whether I'd be any use to what was a project rooted in the sector, but one that I really felt that I wanted to try and join the discussion and the dialogue and kind of to help progress in this sphere. I'm a researcher, but one that doesn't like research for the sake of research. And I'm somebody that has personal experience of kind of being questioned from that research perspective, as in, well, you're critiquing the sector that you're not a part of. What use is that? So for me, it was a real opportunity to try and do a bit more than research and make recommendations, but to also try and participate in a process of change. I think as researchers in development studies, I think we all want to see our research leading to impact, but it's very hard to do in traditional research routes. And this for me is not a traditional research route. It's the opposite. And I've absolutely loved that side of it. I've loved the much more collaborative networking, that it's not research, it's discussion, it's debate, it's building on and from and with each other. It's the first time where I've seen diverse perspectives at the center of every single conversation, and it's been transformational even in that sense, for me as a researcher. So yes, I didn't see all of those aspects before I joined. I joined hoping that I might make more of a difference than I will do writing articles, but it's been a really amazing process.
Thank you. So what we did in our first year was we tried to uncover, why is the system stuck? You know, I've been trying to do this for 25 years. I think we've all been, and I can see Venetia nodding her head and Bert nodding his head, you know, in civil society, wanting to strangle INGOs at times, or being within INGOs and wanting to strangle our managers. I was in that situation once or twice. And I guess what I would like to ask maybe from a couple of people is, what were the areas of stuckness that you thought your prototype might address? And maybe I'll direct that to Tabo and Venetia to begin with.
I think Tabo can start and I'll add to that.
Okay, thank you, colleagues. Thank you all for giving us the chance. I think for me, what really, I think on our side came out clear as the areas of stuckness is the issue of firstly, the linkages in terms of what the INGOs are looking for and what are really the pressing issues and the challenges faced by the local organizations. So the dealing between the two was really an area of stuckness, but also there's the issue of around declining support for human rights organizations by international NGOs, which really in repressive countries like Swaziland became quite an area of interest. But you'll find that the interest of INGOs mostly is on projects that are less controversial and on areas that are less about fundamental rights and the needs of the people on the ground. Hence the link between the two, and also that will mean all the need for change will not find the traction that it needs from the local organizations, but also the local organizations will not find the necessary traction from the international INGOs, international organizations, which I think for me, that is what led to the stuckness that we will see, but also the rigid approach in terms of the support that is given to the smaller or local organizations. You find that it is not relevant to the needs of the local organizations as projected by the international NGOs. So I think that would be my input on that question. But I think Comrade Venetia can also input on that.
Venetia, so it's this real mismatch. It's this real mismatch between below what's wanted and needed versus what's on offer from kind of the international sector. Venetia, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, maybe just very quickly, you know, Deborah, INGOs play a very important role in say our part of the world, you know. And there have been some very significant changes, especially at the time when, you know, for an example, Amnesty was no longer based in London, but now is based in South Africa or in the broader South. And that move, whether it was called localization or the like, actually became quite competitive. And not just from a financial perspective where, you know, in terms of voice as well, where our social movements or our local organizations now, even their voice was getting completely marginalized by either the media or other sectors within the South. And I think that led to another big imbalance between what one would say the INGOs and then the local organizations, where now you had not just the finance, but you also had the voice now and competing in the local context. The other thing was, you know, when that also happened, you found that the INGOs began to take on a lot of the role around planning, around learning, around the lessons of, you know, our struggles. And more, there was just less space for local organizations to begin to have their voice in that, you know, around the issues in the country. And that was happening on the one side. And on the other side, you found that in my own former history, I used to work with the Dutch anti-apartheid movement. And it was a very, so I'm using that a little bit of a reflective space where, you know, you were working with organizations in another country, individuals in another country, but the relationship was extremely equal in a number of ways. They, you know, where the South Africans at the time, and in the Swazis as well, international solidarity is a very strategic pillar of these struggles. So it's not a pillar you give up to anybody, or it's not a pillar that you don't think about. It's a very critical pillar. And the difference, I think, between the two is nowadays, a lot of your INGO engagement is very formulaic. You know, it's very prescriptive. It's within particular parameters of how they perceive maybe the context or what the solutions ought to be. And unfortunately, that's not the experience on the ground. So in terms of the stuckness, I could also imagine that the INGOs are particularly far away from these struggles that we talk about. And it must be very difficult to understand how they manifest and what they mean in the lives of people in that country. So there's a lot of reliance on the formulae of the reporting, on the nature of doing it, the logical frameworks, those types of things, projectizing. And I can imagine it was just to make life a lot easier, but it didn't, you know. And I think the point you make around the difference between humanitarian and human rights NGOs, that's a very critical one in our areas, particularly because it is something that actually didn't have added value for both sides. So when we were introduced to RINGO, it was about the added value that we would bring in terms of an example of a country that was in need of solidarity or organizations. And it could be done differently because it's a very small place. It's not a country that has a huge amount of donor support. So any new support would actually come in a kind of a new form. So that's my take on it for now.
Thank you. That's really, really interesting. Bert, do you want to talk about, you know, the area of stuckness that you're trying to unstick?
Sure. I guess where our group focused on was on this whole approach to risk and compliance management across the whole international, or across the whole value chain within, you know, the international humanitarian, long-term development, peace building sector. And many of us coming to this based on our own experience that a huge amount of time today and resources is being put into managing so-called risks and compliances. And indeed, it's only increasing. And sometimes the increase comes for good reasons, but taken together over time, it is really an inordinate amount of time that is being allocated to managing risk and compliances. A huge amount of processes and forms, and particularly if you are a local partner organization and you have different international partners, you have to service multiple regimes from donors or their intermediaries, like INGOs or other partners. And often we and others, when we talk about this, feeling really dissatisfied about this. You know, such an amount of effort goes into it, but many participants, from the donor to the intermediary to the local partner, actually feeling rather dissatisfied about it, and efforts to make it better, sometimes make it worse in a perverse way. You know, yet another form, another tool that tries to address it actually adds more burden, and that burden is obviously most acutely felt, again, down the value chain, if I can use that phrase, to, you know, the local partners in particular. And there's a whole infrastructure being created, particularly in global north organizations, to handle that, and that creates then their own incentives and interests and behaviors. So that was the stuckness that we experienced and wanted to explore. Is there a different way, really also by working across the value chain? Because from conversations, I think many of us feel stuck in the relationship and maybe often point fingers to each other. And so this is what RINGO maybe offers as an opportunity to really come together across the value chain and see whether, yeah, we can actually reimagine the way we handle risk and compliance.
Thank you. We can talk a little bit more about how you're approaching that. I'm going to come to Emanuela, but can I just ask Nikki briefly to tell me your area of stuckness?
Sure, of course, Deborah. So for me, the space of resource flows was the area of stuckness that I was most interested in. I think if we're talking about the strength and sustainability and the thriving of a civil society sector, then an aid chain that kind of allocates funding on very sort of short scale timelines along very strict service delivery outcomes, that cannot be the answer to how money flows. And we did some research. I did some research with a colleague at Sheffield called Dan Brockington, mapping the UK's development NGO sector and where they got their money from. And I think I felt particularly passionate about this because the findings there kind of absolutely astounded me, that UK international NGOs get by far the most funding from the UK public. 40% of the entire sector's income over 5 years, totaling nearly £10 billion, came from private donors. That most of that money, maybe not all of it, but that reaches international NGOs on an unrestricted basis. It's not donor funding with tight conditionalities. So why is that not being passed on in that manner? So for me, addressing this problem, getting long-term, predictable and unrestricted funding has got to be one of the core focuses for change in this area.
And it's a real systemic lever. So to be clear, what we RINGO, for the most part, we're doing is looking at things that individual organizations can't do on their own, right? They're these systemic dimensions. Emanuela, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, thank you, Deborah. Yes, it's really interesting. And I was wondering, can you please tell me more about how did you develop, how are you working toward these prototypes? Whether there is a common methodology across them or whether each of them works independently, and how do you develop them?
That's such a perfect question, because that was the next question, but you've worded it much better than I have. So what I want to ask any of our panelists who want to come in really is to talk about, what's the difference with this way of working? What are you trying to do to address your particular systemic problem? And what's unique about the methodology? Who wants to jump in? Anybody? Otherwise, I'll call your name and put you on the spot. Venetia, do you want to, or Tabo, do you want to give it a go?
Maybe sorry.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just try to do that. So the process or the methodology, I mean, I don't know if it's a methodology, it feels so instinctive right now. So the way we're looking at it is there needs to be an approach from both sides. So there's the internal, which is Swaziland, and then there's the external, which is the INGOs. So we've kind of looked at two platforms and the two interacting and developing forward. In Swaziland, you had a situation where organizations were very desperate, working on their own, and then they formed a coalition. So the support was to get this coalition really organized and owned by the various partners who could then make a joint pitch. So it wasn't then as if each organization would actually contact an INGO on their own, although we did have some of that happening, but to try and organize it from inside. So we had collective asks, and then hopefully from the outside, there would be this kind of a collective as well, dealing with Swaziland not as individual organizations, but more from a collective NGO perspective.
Thank you. Bert, I wonder if you want to touch on a little bit about the RINGO process. I think is that a bit of what you're asking, Emanuela? Like, how do we facilitate the process, or is that what you're interested in knowing?
Yeah, is that, and I also was interested in understanding whether the different prototypes are developed following a shared agreed methodology, or if each of them develops independently and then you share the learning. And
so I'll answer a bit of that, and then I'm going to hand it to Bert to talk about his own experience in that space, because I've got the overview of all of the prototypes. So we have a methodology on systems change thinking, which is a lot like kind of design thinking processes, where you prototype. So we understand, we started with sense making, understanding a lot of mural boards, where the system was stuck, looking at research, talking to people, coming back collectively, sharing that understanding. We did that over the first year. And then we did, some visioning, how might we questions, and all of those questions we've put up in on that website. I've shared the link with you. How might we overcome the barrier of risk, right? How might we get more resources to the Global South? How might we have shared power relationships? All of those big questions, and then narrowing it down to try and get that into a what. And then the prototyping process also follows a rough methodology for each of them, which is kind of, we're trying to get people to move away from having all the answers to just trying something out. And I think what you've done in the risk prototype, I think demonstrates that very well. It's, we have a lot of thinkers in the lab, and getting people to move from analysis thinking, oh, this is wrong, into, okay, but what can I do about it? And what can I do about it that's just small and doable, rather than changing everything all at once? Come back and learn, do it again. All of them are supposed to be doing that. I won't say they all are perfectly, but then we come back to the lab, and we just had a shared learning session a couple of weeks ago, actually. And then we're doing another one in October, and then a big learning session in early November. Bert, do you want to give the example of yours? What's different about this way of working?
Yeah. I mean, it's indeed quite a distinct way of working, and it's both the hardest but also the most interesting part of it. And we've been really supported by a coach, which RINGO provides to help us as a team to go through this and kind of guide the overall process. And I think one thing that we've been really trying to hold, and it's not easy, is kind of recognizing that what we're trying to address, this stuckness, is really a complex problem, and therefore there is no silver bullet, right? A single solution, but rather as complex problems theory would guide you. It's about making shifts in the system that over time will bring you towards better outcomes, and therefore really stepping away from coming up with maybe a smart, wonderful idea, a pilot and a project, and then run with that, and then hope that 3 years later, the evaluation confirms that it's been positive, although the stuckness that brought us to the area of analysis in the first place probably indicates that approach hasn't been particularly successful. So it's really holding us back, or trying to hold us, prevent us from doing exactly that, but really kind of trying to think about, okay, what are maybe these small prototypes, these small assumptions we want to test, that based on the process of prototyping then can help us to bring us forward to that emerging solution. And so we're really trying to hold to that, kind of say, okay, we don't know yet the full solution. Indeed, there is not a single solution, but what are kind of the small aspects we want to test and learn from, and then on that basis move forward. So that's been really fascinating, but also hard, because obviously we're torn between our very big ambition of wanting to deal with that stuckness and break it, that big ambition, yet prototyping is something small. So that's been really a challenge, or a tension and a challenge. I think the second one we've encountered is this methodology of prototyping. I think comes particularly from the IT sector, from design thinking, where arguably testing is almost frictionless, right? I mean, you know, you create a new widget, you put it on Facebook and you test it, and you'll have the feedback, I don't know, within a few weeks, and you'll know whether it worked or not. I mean, obviously the kind of things we want to test do not work like this. So that's the second tension, that running a prototype isn't frictionless and instant as maybe, you know, where in the technology world. So that's some of the tensions that we're still working through in relation to the prototyping methodology. But as I said, it's the most fascinating and hardest bit, and maybe that's the good feeling.
You went from a big picture ambition to shift the risk burden, to look at the risk burden and proportionality of that risk burden down the kind of development supply chain. And what you're testing out is something very tiny, is to say, okay, if we look at two aspects of this risk burden, maybe it's keeping receipts. Yes. Can we get the key actors in the supply chain together to see if there's a different method to negotiate what that reporting should be? Because, you know, there are needs at the bilateral level. They have to report on something. There's accountability needs to the general public. You know, the INGO has some tax requirements or whatever it might be, or charity regulation requirements. So it's getting that supply chain together and seeing if by having a conversation about even just two aspects of this, can we reduce that risk burden? So it's just trying it, and then we'll come back and learn from that and hopefully go forward. I will say that one of our other prototypes, the language, we've got one on language and communications, is very IT focused, and it's perfect for this because we're testing stuff out. And if anyone wants to read about that, contact me or look on the website. Are there any other questions from the group before I go on to another question? Because I realize I have a tendency to dominate. Any other questions? Let me ask, I'll start with Nikki, maybe. What potential do you think your prototype has to leverage change in the system?
So for me, I'm kind of excited about potential with our prototype on two fronts. One, I think, is the power of this new modality of funding, like what civil society organizations around the world can achieve if we move away from this starvation cycle, as Humentum recently called it, towards a system that provides long-term, predictable and unrestricted funding. It allows planning, it allows safety nets, it allows confidence, it allows innovation, it allows civil society organizations to take control. So that really is at the heart of what we want to do. But that requires another huge shift, which I'm equally excited about, I think. And that's this shift away from within sort of the supporters of the movement in the UK, and then hopefully expanding globally, this shift in mindset from charity to solidarity. The ways in which we will link up those that support the movement with the organizations benefiting from this new form of support in ways that help them to learn about the complexity of this thing that we call development, that learn about the power that this alternative way of supporting development can have, the power that kind of empowering the right actors can have, really changing that narrative of what we can do. So we had a conversation with Alan Fowler recently, and he always has really snappy sound bites and things. And he says, the only thing we can do is get out of the way and let other people do what they do best. So that's the role of international NGOs in the future, to get out of the way professionally and support rather than direct. And I think there's a crucial role in kind of public understanding. So in ways that the public demand that change, as well as the sector reflect internally upon us. So I think we really want to get that right. And I think if we can start that shift and reach a certain scale, then again, if there's a ripple effect beyond that for greater change in the sector, in the way that international NGOs package what they do, start to put their partners at the forefront of their communications rather than saying, this is us that's done it. It's like, tell the story in different ways, let people tell their own stories. And I think that will have a lot of power too.
Venetia or Tabo, do you want to come in on this? What potential do you think your prototype has to leverage change in the system? I know you've been, looking at creating a template out of your prototype. So that's one of the things we're trying to do is, while they're very specific prototypes, how do we make them mainstream? How do we get them adopted in the system? So Venetia or Tabo, would you like to touch on that?
I'll probably ask Tabo to start this one and I'll come in.
Tabo, can you hear us? Can you go off? Oh, you're not on mute anymore. Can you hear us?
Yes, I think for us, the most important thing has been also to ensure that we try to influence INGOs through the system to ensure that at least their outlook in terms of alternative solidarity, support for the Swazi challenges, and also ensuring that we look at how best can we find alternative sources of funding for a multi-sectoral or multi-stakeholder platform, and how it can be enhanced in terms of its capacity to coordinate and lead or drive the struggles internally in Swaziland, but also with strict compliance to, of course, the rules and regulations, the needs that has been put out there by the INGOs, so that we also, as much as we try to advance our cause here as local organizations, but also there is that compliance, and we try to, in that process, we try to bridge the gap between the two, which is the international organizations and the local organizations, but also try to look into how we can build competence to consolidate and advance the struggles in the context of closing civic space in the case of Swaziland. So I think for us, that will be the most important thing, and that is why we have structured our prototype the way we have, and we think Swaziland provides an opportunity for international NGOs to, also intervene in a way that will ensure that Swaziland is not a failed state, that as we are seeing in examples of transitions that we have seen in the southern tip of Africa in recent years. Yeah, I think that would be my input. I think also Comrade Venetia can also come in.
Thank you, Taba. I think for me, the point Nikki made, moving from charity to solidarity, is extremely critical. And I think it kind of sums up a lot of our prototype as well. The real potential is in the development of alternatives. And I think therein, RINGO shares the space with a number of other processes that are looking at more longer term sustainable alternatives within civil society and regarding the actions of civil society. The potentials are both for organizations in Swaziland as well as the INGOs. I mean, the COVID pandemic has upended all of our lives, but it's also changed the way we work. We're never going to get back to that. And I think this just signifies a kind of line in the sand. We're going forward. the kind of interrelations and the engagements between North and South organizations need to be on a different value system, and I'm not sure if ideology is a correct word, but certainly needs to be based on some kind of values, and not about projects. It's not that, you know, and it goes a little bit deeper than that. So it has political value as well as some economic value. And the biggest opportunity for this would be that processes undertaken become a lot more sustainable locally.
That's really interesting. Bert, I'm going to ask you a question that wasn't on your list. As the only person here who is sitting, well, I don't know about our guest, but who is sitting in an international NGO. And I realized, Nikki, we didn't ask for people to introduce themselves. That's terrible of us. Who's sitting in an international NGO. What is your hypothesis on the future of INGOs? You can take a moment to think about it. And if anyone else wants to come in with their own thoughts on that, I think that would be terrific.
Interesting question, Deborah.
Sorry.
I mean, personally, I mean, I'll speak from my own perspective. I think there's really a need to evolve the value proposition of INGOs, and you know, the way we contribute to the mission needs to change. And for some of us, I think that change is long overdue. And you know, that means not to say that what has done or is being done is not effective, although maybe some part of it is, but really acknowledging that, you know, our role has to evolve as INGOs. And it's much more like somebody said, Nikki, and others spoke of. It's really shifting away from projects to solidarity and other forms of, you know, partnership and collaboration, and that intermediary role that sometimes we play may still, in some instances, be of value. It's not where the future is for INGOs, and so I think it's really a field about reimagining the role. Means also letting go of certain views as to what the role is, and that's not easy for institutions, and maybe that's where some of the challenges lay. So I think that's really the journey for many northern-based INGOs, I feel, yeah, I think that's where also some of the challenges sit in terms of, you know, reimagining a role, stepping away from some historical roles, but really finding better forms of support and partnership to the local change makers, right? The organizations at the front line that Thabo and others are representing, and I think that's really where our work is and our journey is. Thank
you. And Nikki, I'm going to shape that question slightly for you as an academic. So I hope you usually have healthy skepticism. So you can see where it could go, which I think is probably my hypothesis and Bert's, really, that repositioned role. As an academic, what do you see as the likelihood of that happening? Is it happening now? Are there enough kind of signals out there? And that's not just the UK, you know, the Dutch NGO community. RINGO has done some work with the Francophone NGO community, which barely talks about decolonization, for example. You know, so what do you think is the likelihood of such a trajectory?
Also a really interesting and difficult question. It's definitely something, I mean, if the time's not now, when will it ever be? In the sense that there is such passion, there is such motivation, and there is such drive and demand for this change. And a lot of, I think, INGOs are invested in it for the right reasons. They're responding to a call from below, which has been, what, sort of since 2016, so 5 or 6 years now, and it's finally being kind of taken seriously, even in the INGO context.
You mean the
And I
grand
think,
bargain? You mean the grand bargain?
and the grand bargain, and then the Shift the Power movement from the Global Fund. So those both emerged in sort of 2016. One sort of top down, one very bottom up, but it's taken a while for the INGO sector to catch up, but it's there now, it's front and center. But I think the problem I see is that we have two kind of processes going on at the same time. And Dylan Matthews, who's another RINGO lab, has written about this in a lot of his blogs and the tensions he sees in what's going on in the sector. In the INGO space, we're seeing certain kinds of responses. There are institutional efforts to kind of make changes to how they operate or to the ways that they run. And then you see from the bottom these kind of more radical political calls for a much greater scale of transformation. And I don't see where they meet in the middle. I don't think the sum of all of the individual changes can scale up to be the systemic transformation that I think the sector really, really needs. And I think that's one of the challenges, is it's not just shifting the power in terms of how one institution empowers their partners that they work with globally. It's the system, and there are two levels, and I see a real tension there. So I think all progress is good progress, but I think I'm skeptical that a lot of the action going on right now is not tinkering around the edges, but it's not quite the radical transformative systems change that I think many of us aspire to.
Interesting. God, we could talk about lots. We're in our last 5 minutes, and I guess what I can just ask maybe the RINGO folk to add any last thoughts, and anyone else who wants to come in with any last thoughts. I'm going to start with Venetia, please.
Thank you, Deborah. I think for me, you know, in the current situation in the, let's say, Southern Africa, I think it's similar across the continent. NGOs are not viewed as benignly by our regimes and our governments. So there might be some kind of forcing of hand in terms of the changes. And I think that's something that, you know, we didn't bring in enough. Do have quite a lot of that in the closing of space, particularly around INGOs. So they're also a little bit of an endangered species in our end of the world. And I think the RINGO project, in terms of the, you know, the transformation you seek, is also about their own ability to continue on this end.
Thank you. Thabo, any final thoughts?
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Deborah. I think for us, this has been quite new for me, and I'm learning quite a lot. I think it's a learning space for us, but also, you know, one can't help it but you know, be optimistic in terms of how this will, you know, advance our quest for support for the local organizations in our case, but also the phenomenon of shrinking funding base, but also shrinking civic space. How do we strike the balance, more especially, as Venetia has said, in the southern tip of Africa and in Africa in general? And we can see the trends are almost the same. So I think this opportunity for us, I think, is really a great one for us to rethink that and rethink how we can best ensure that our initiatives at local level and INGOs are at least in tandem, and at least we are able to find each other for us to be able to advance our cause at a local level. Yeah, I think that would be my thoughts.
Thank you. Bert, we've got like 2 minutes, so can you do a 30-second, any final remarks, and then I'm going to give the final floor to Nikki as the organizer.
I'll echo what Thabo was saying, that optimism. I mean, the way I felt in the RINGO journey sometimes I sit between hope and despair, and that's the zone, you know, hope of the potential and despair of the struggles. But I was told that's actually the zone within which innovation happens. So I remain optimistic, like Pablo, that something good will emerge from this process, even if it's sometimes hard.
Thank you. And Nikki, you've got just a second. You've got
1 minute.
less than a minute, apparently.
To say a big thank you to all of our contributors and people that have come to listen to us. The videos will, I think, remain, the videos that give more detail about what our prototypes are, they'll remain on the DSA website. So please have a look if you haven't already, and follow the RINGO journey. It's at a really exciting time. So this is just a flavor of the prototypes that are going on, and they'll be going on for the next 4 to 6 months, and reconvening sort of October, November, for a kind of a big festival then. So yeah, follow the progress, and just a flavor of the inspiration that we've seen today, really.
Loads of data on the website for those who are interested in data and learning in academics. And we would welcome any pra-academics who want to join our work. We'll find a role for you, I promise.
Yes, and there is a need. Final words, since it's the DSA conference, there is a need for academia and researchers to keep up, to play their role in capturing these experiences, highlighting the successes, investigating the challenges, and disseminating some of the brilliant work that's being done. So yes, please join hands with us. Yeah, and thank you everyone from all corners of the world that we've joined today.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki, for setting it up.
Oh, my pleasure. I appreciate your time and efforts. It's been great to connect.
Thanks.
Thanks, Deborah.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, Emanuela.
Bye.
Bye.